Chapter 9 of The House on the Borderland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Alan Winterout. The House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgson. Chapter 9 in the Cellars. At last, what with being tired and cold, and the uneasiness that possessed me, I resolved to take a walk through the house, first calling in at the study for a glass of brandy to warm me. This I did, and while there I examined the door carefully, but found all as I had left it the night before. The day was just breaking as I left the tower, though it was still too dark in the house to be able to see without a light, and I took one of the study candles with me on my round. By the time I had finished the ground floor, the daylight was creeping in wanly through the barred windows. My search had shown me nothing fresh. Everything appeared to be in order, and I was on the point of extinguishing my candle, when the thought suggested itself to me to have another glance round the cellars. I had not, if I remembered rightly, been into them since my hasty search on the evening of the attack. For perhaps the half of a minute I hesitated. I would have been very willing to forego the task, as indeed I am inclined to think any man well might, for of all the great awe-inspiring rooms in this house, the cellars are the hugest and weirdest. Great gloomy caverns of places, unlit by any ray of daylight. Yet I would not shrink to work. I felt that to do so would smack of sheer cowardice. Besides, as I reassured myself, the cellars were really the most unlikely places in which to come across anything dangerous, considering that they can be entered only through a heavy oaken door, the key of which I carry always on my person. It is in the smallest of these places that I keep my wine, a gloomy hole close to the foot of the cellar stairs, and beyond which I have seldom proceeded. Indeed, save for the rummage round already mentioned, I doubt whether I had ever, before, been right through the cellars. As I unlocked the great door at the top of the steps, I paused, nervously, a moment, at the strange, desolate smell that assailed my nostrils. Then, throwing the barrel of my weapon forward, I descended, slowly, into the darkness of the underground regions. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, I stood for a moment and listened. All was silent, save for a faint drip, drip of water falling, drop by drop, somewhere to my left. As I stood, I noticed how quietly the candle burnt, never a flicker nor flare, so utterly windless was the place. Quietly, I moved from cellar to cellar. I had but a very dim memory of their arrangement. The impressions left by my first search were blurred. I had recollections of a succession of great cellars, and of one, greater than the rest, the roof of which was upheld by pillars. Beyond that my mind was hazy, and predominated by a sense of cold and darkness and shadows. Now, however, it was different, for although nervous I was sufficiently collected to be able to look about me and note the structure and size of the different vaults I entered. Of course, with the amount of light given by my candle, it was not possible to examine each place minutely, but I was enabled to notice, as I went along, that the walls appeared to be built with wonderful precision and finish, while here and there an occasional massive pillar shot up to support the vaulted roof. Thus I came, at last, to the great cellar that I remembered. It is reached through a huge arched entrance, on which I observed strange, fantastic carvings which threw queer shadows under the light of my candle. As I stood and examined these thoughtfully, it occurred to me how strange it was that I should be so little acquainted with my own house. Yet this may be easily understood when one realizes the size of this ancient pile, and the fact that only my sister and I live in it, occupying a few of the rooms such as are wants decide. Holding the light high, I passed on into the cellar, and, keeping to the right, paced slowly up until I reached the further end. I walked quietly and looked cautiously about as I went, but so far as the light showed I saw nothing unusual. At the top I turned to the left, still keeping to the wall, and so continued until I had traversed the whole of the vast chamber. As I moved along, I noticed that the floor was composed of solid rock, in places covered with a damp mold, in others bare, or almost so, save for a thin coating of light grey dust. I had halted at the doorway. Now, however, I turned, and made my way up the center of the place, passing among the pillars, and glancing to right and left as I moved. About halfway up the cellar, I stubbed my foot against something that gave out a metallic sound. Stooping quickly, I held my candle, and saw that the object I had kicked was a large metal ring. Bending lower, I cleared the dust from around it, and presently discovered that it was attached to a ponderous trap door, black with age. Feeling excited, and wondering to where it could lead, I laid my gun on the floor, and, sticking the candle in the trigger guard, took the ring in both hands and pulled. The trap creaked loudly, the sound echoing vaguely through the huge place, and opened heavily. Propping the edge on my knee, I reached for the candle and held it in the opening, moving it right and left. But I could see nothing. I was puzzled and surprised. There were no signs of steps, nor even the appearance of there ever having been any. Nothing, save an empty blackness. I might have been looking down into a bottomless, sideless well. Then, even as I stared, full of perplexity, I seemed to hear, far down, as though from untold depths, a faint whisper of sound. I bent my head quickly, more into the opening, and listened, intently. It may have been fancy, but I could have sworn to hear a soft titter that grew into a hideous chuckling, faint and distant. Startled, I leapt backward, letting the trap fall with a hollow clang that filled the place with echoes. Even then, I seemed to hear that mocking, suggestive laughter, but this, I knew, must be my imagination. The sound I had heard was far too slight to penetrate through the cumbrous trap. For a full minute, I stood there quivering, glancing nervously behind and before, but the great cellar was silent as a grave, and gradually I shook off the frightened sensation. With a calmer mind, I became again curious to know into what the trap opened, but could not then summon sufficient courage to make a further investigation. One thing I felt, however, was that the trap ought to be secured. This I accomplished by placing upon it several large pieces of dressed stone which I had noticed in my tour along the east wall. Then, after a final scrutiny of the rest of the place, I retraced my way through the cellars to the stairs, and so reached the daylight with an infinite feeling of relief that the uncomfortable task was accomplished. Chapter 9. Recording by Alan Winterowd. boomcoach.blogspot.com. Chapter 10 of The House on the Borderland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Alan Winterowd. The House on the Borderland, by William Hope Hodgson. Chapter 10. The Time of Waiting. The sun was now warm and shining brightly, forming a wondrous contrast to the dark and dismal cellars, and it was with comparatively light feelings that I made my way up to the tower to survey the gardens. There I found everything quiet, and after a few minutes went down to Mary's room. Here, having knocked and received a reply, I unlocked the door. My sister was sitting quietly on the bed, as though waiting. She seemed quite herself again, and made no attempt to move away as I approached, yet I observed that she scanned my face anxiously, as though in doubt, and had but half assured in her mind that there was nothing to fear from me. To my questions as to how she felt, she replied sanely enough that she was hungry and would like to go down to prepare breakfast if I did not mind. For a minute I meditated whether it would be safe to let her out. Finally I told her that she might go, on condition that she promised not to attempt to leave the house or meddle with any of the outer doors. At my mention of the doors, a sudden look of fright crossed her face, but she said nothing, save to give the required promise, and then left the room silently. Crossing the floor, I approached Pepper. He had waked as I entered, but, beyond a slight yelp of pleasure and a soft rapping with his tail, had kept quiet. Now, as I patted him, he made an attempt to stand up, and succeeded only to fall back on his side with a little yowl of pain. I spoke to him and bade him lie still. I was greatly delighted with his improvement, and also with the natural kindness of my sister's heart, in taking such good care of him, in spite of her condition of mind. After a while, I left him, and went downstairs to my study. In a little time, Mary appeared, carrying a tray on which smoked a hot breakfast. As she entered the room, I saw her gaze fasten on the props that supported the study door. Her lips tightened, and I thought she paled slightly, but that was all. Putting the tray down at my elbow, she was leaving the room quietly when I called her back. She came, it seemed a little timidly, as though startled, and I noted that her hand clutched at her apron nervously. "Come, Mary," I said, "cheer up. Things look brighter. I've seen none of the creatures since yesterday morning early." She looked at me in a curiously puzzled manner, as though not comprehending. Then intelligence swept into her eyes, and fear, but she said nothing, beyond an unintelligible murmur of acquiescence. After that, I kept silence. It was evident that any reference to the swine things was more than her shaken nerves could bear. Breakfast over, I went up to the tower. Here, during the greater part of the day, I maintained a strict watch over the gardens. Once or twice I went down to the basement, to see how my sister was getting along. Each time I found her quiet, and curiously submissive. Indeed, on the last occasion, she even ventured to address me, on her own account, with regard to some household matter that needed attention. Though this was done with an almost extraordinary timidity, I hailed it with happiness, as being the first words voluntarily spoken, since the critical moment when I had caught her unbarring the back door to go out among those waiting brutes. I wondered whether she was aware of her attempt, and how near a thing it had been, but refrained from questioning her, thinking it best to let well alone. That night I slept in a bed, the first time for 2 nights. In the morning I rose early, and took a walk through the house. All was as it should be, and I went up to the tower to have a look at the gardens. Here again I found perfect quietness. At breakfast, when I met Mary, I was greatly pleased to see that she had sufficiently regained command over herself to be able to greet me in a perfectly natural manner. She talked sensibly and quietly, only keeping carefully from any mention of the past couple of days. In this I humored her, to the extent of not attempting to lead the conversation in that direction. Earlier in the morning I had been to see Pepper. He was mending rapidly, and bade fair to be on his legs in earnest in another day or two. Before leaving the breakfast table, I made some reference to his improvement. In the short discussion that followed, I was surprised to gather, from my sister's remarks, that she was still under the impression that his wound had been given by the wildcat of my invention. It made me feel almost ashamed of myself for deceiving her. Yet the lie had been told to prevent her from being frightened; and then I had been sure that she must have known the truth, later, when those brutes had attacked the house. During the day I kept on the alert, spending much of my time, as on the previous day, in the tower; but not a sign could I see of the swine creatures, nor hear any sound. Several times the thought had come to me that the things had, at last, left us, but up to this time I had refused to entertain the idea seriously. Now, however, I began to feel that there was reason for hope. It would soon be 3 days since I had seen any of the things, but still I intended to use the utmost caution. For all that I could tell, this protracted silence might be a ruse to tempt me from the house, perhaps right into their arms. The thought of such a contingency was, alone, sufficient to make me circumspect. So it was that the 4th, 5th, and 6th days went by, quietly, without my making any attempt to leave the house. On the 6th day, I had the pleasure of seeing Pepper once more upon his feet; and, though still very weak, he managed to keep me company during the whole of that day. Chapter 10. Recording by Alan Winterowd. Boomcoach.blogspot.com